This is a training session regarding entering and processing trade invoices in the accounts payable system. In order to do so, we select the Invoices option from the Accounts Payable menu. The Accounts Payable Invoice Batch Entry System now comes into view. In the list box on the left-hand side of the screen, we see a list of the batches that are currently set up for processing accounts payable invoices. We can add or change a batch using the buttons supplied here below the list box. If we click on the Change button, we can see that a batch may have a user ID, a description, and some defaults for entering invoices. Here we can enter a default checking account and credit card account. Invoices entered in this batch may be marked as prepaid by check or by credit card. If the default checking account field here is left blank, the system will use the default checking account from the Accounts Payable Setup window. If the default credit card account field is left blank here, an invoice marked as paid by credit card during invoice entry will grab the first credit card account it finds on the balance sheet as the credit card used. This checkbox lets you set your preference for repetitive insert. When you have finished entering an invoice and click the OK button, the system can either close the invoice entry window and return to the main batch entry window, or, if this box is checked, it can clear the fields and prepare the entry window for the entry of another subsequent invoice. Place a tick in this box to turn on repetitive insert. This checkbox refers to the invoice pay type. When invoices are entered, they can be flagged as open, paid by hand check, or paid by credit card. If you are entering a number of invoices that were all paid by credit card, you may want the system to remember the pay type of the previously entered invoice on each subsequent invoice. Check this box if this is your desire. Check this box, and the program will flash a message each time you save a prepaid invoice, reminding you that you have flagged the invoice as prepaid. This box refers to the individual line items that will be entered on a trade invoice. If the box is ticked, then all new line items added to the invoice will have the Subject to Sales Tax box ticked by default. Here, you can specify the default detail type. As we are entering invoices into this particular batch, will we most likely be charging our invoice expenses to general ledger account numbers, to jobs, to pieces of equipment, or to inventory? We indicate our preference here. When an accounts payable invoice is charged to a job, it is usually charged to a budget with cost type M for materials, or S for subcontracts in the case of a subcontract invoice. If this batch is special, in that you want invoices in the batch to be charged to some other cost type by default, you can enter that cost type here. For example, you may have a batch where all job invoices will be charged to cost codes with the G for general cost type. Check this box, and each time you charge a line item to a job cost code, the system will check to see if your line item amount pushes the cost code over budget, and flashes a warning message if this is the case. Next, we can instruct the system to remember the job ID we have entered in each invoice as a default for the entry of the next invoice. When a subcontract invoice is entered, the system will normally assume that the invoice will be charged to a budget line item with type S for subcontract. If you want the system to disallow any other cost type, such as M for materials or G for general, on a subcontract invoice, place a tick in this box. We can also specify what type of invoices will most frequently be entered into this batch: trade invoices, subcontract invoices, or retention payment invoices. When the Add button is pressed to add a new invoice to this batch, the ensuing selection window will have the appropriate invoice type button highlighted by default. So all you have to do is press Enter. Next, we can specify whether this is a repeating batch. Repeating batches are good for things like entering in vehicle or loan payments, or any payment that happens each month. If this is a repeating batch, we can specify the frequency with which this batch repeats. In other words, when we post the invoices in this batch, how do we want the dates of the invoices to be modified for the next round of processing? We can indicate a number of days or a number of months. When the batch of invoices is posted, the system leaves copies of the invoice in the batch for future processing, usually a month from now. At that time, the new payment invoice from the vendor will probably have a different invoice number than the one just posted. If you place a tick in this box, the invoices left in the repeating batch after invoice posting will have their invoice number fields blanked out. You will need to provide the new invoice numbers next month when you post the invoices again. Once we have selected our batch, we can begin entering invoices into that batch. On the right-hand side of the screen, we have a list box that shows us all the invoices included in the highlighted batch. We can easily move an invoice from the current batch to another batch by clicking the invoice, dragging it to the list of batches, and dropping it into a different batch. We can enter a new trade invoice at this point by clicking the Add button and selecting Trade Invoice. If the purchase order system has been installed, a question will be asked concerning purchase orders. This question refers to the reconciliation of previously entered purchase orders. This reconciliation is the subject of a separate training session in the purchase order module, so we won't say any more here. The system now brings the Accounts Payable Trade Invoice Entry screen into view. The first thing we must do is select a vendor. We can do so by typing in the vendor name or number,
or pressing the lookup button and picking from a list,
or pulling down this list box and picking from an alphabetical list of vendors. We can then enter the purchase order number, if any. We can also enter the invoice number of the invoice received from the vendor. Now we can specify a default job, which will be used for entering our invoice line items. If all the line items on this invoice are to be charged to the same job, enter that job number here. Otherwise, just leave the job number blank. This field will display the accounts payable account that will be used for this invoice. This is the default account for the system or for this vendor. Normally, we don't change this account. We can indicate whether this particular invoice has already been paid. If we select Paid by Hand Check or Debit Card or Paid by Credit Card, the system will change the entry fields on the right-hand side of the screen to indicate paid date, a check number or card name, and a checking account or credit card account number. If we select Open, we are asked only for an invoice date and a due date for this invoice. We're going to enter this particular invoice as an open invoice. Therefore, it will have a due date. The system will calculate the due date by looking into the vendor record, retrieving the vendor's due terms, and applying those terms to the invoice date. This checkbox will cause the invoice to be posted with a Hold Payment flag. If the box is checked, you can enter the reason for the hold, and the posted invoice will not be available for payment selection until the hold is lifted. Here we can enter a short description of this invoice that will show up on the check stub when a check is printed for payment of this invoice. We can now enter line item detail for our trade invoice. We do this by clicking the Add button. A detail entry window now comes into view. Here we specify whether this detail line item
will be charged to a job, a GL account,
a piece of equipment, or inventory. If we select GL account, then we can choose from a list of all our general ledger accounts which account this line item will be charged to. We can then indicate a quantity and or a unit cost. We must have a dollar amount. Now, the dollar amount can be calculated as a function of the unit cost times the quantity, or if we leave the unit cost field blank, we can type in whatever amount we choose. We do not enter the amount of tax while entering the detail. We merely indicate whether or not this is a taxable line item. The system will assign a tax amount to this line item at a later time.
In the same vein, if this line item will be subject to a shipping charge, we can check this box. The shipping amount for the whole invoice is entered later. This box refers to use taxes. If we click the Lookup button, we can see our stored tax codes. When the invoice is posted, the system will check to see if the tax code we selected has a state with a sales tax rate attached to it. If it does, the system will accrue use tax for that state during the posting. That amount will not show up anywhere on the invoice, only on the posting reports.
When we click the OK button to save our entry, the system will anticipate that we may wish to enter another line item, and it will bring us another empty detail screen. For our second line item, we will charge the cost to a job. We can select a job and a valid cost code. We can then enter the optional quantity and unit cost, the dollar amount, and whether or not this line item is taxable. After we save this entry, we will insert another line item. This line item we will charge to a piece of equipment. If the equipment costing program has been purchased, we can select from a list of equipment and select a cost category associated with that piece of equipment. Specify the optional quantity and unit cost and the dollar amount, and whether or not this line item is taxable. If the inventory system has been purchased, we can charge one of our invoice detail line items to inventory. Select Inventory and the following fields will appear: Item ID, Location, and Area.
As we click on the Lookup button for the item ID,
we find a list of all the different inventory items we track. Select the desired inventory item. At this point, we're required to indicate where we have stored this item we have purchased. First, we select a location, and then we select an area within that location. Usually, the location and area fields will be filled by default, because they were assigned as defaults when setting up this item ID. Now we can specify the number of units purchased and a unit name. If this vendor's unit cost has been stored in the item master record, it will be displayed automatically in this field. The amount will be automatically calculated as a function of the quantity times the unit cost. Now we will click OK to save the detail line item. Once we've entered all the line items, we can enter the sales tax dollar amount found on the invoice received from the vendor. Once we type in this tax amount and press Enter or Tab, the system will take the dollar amount we've typed into the tax field and apportion it among the taxable line items we've entered in the list box on the left.
Here we can enter a shipping amount. In the same manner as the tax amount, this amount will be distributed among the line items marked as subject to shipping.
We can also enter a disputed amount. This is a dollar amount that showed up on the vendor invoice for goods we did not receive or goods that we did not order. Check this box if you want this invoice separated from other invoices from this vendor during check printing. If the box is checked, this invoice will be included on its own check. Check this other box if you want the check printed for this invoice to include one check stub line item for each invoice line item. Now we could enter a discount for this invoice. When we entered the vendor into the system through the vendor entry screen, we had the option of indicating whether or not this vendor offers discounts and at what percentage rate. If a discount is offered by the vendor, it will be reflected in this screen with the appropriate rate and dollar amount of the discount and the appropriate discount expiration date. Otherwise, we can go into any of these fields and manually enter a discount that has been offered by the vendor for this particular invoice. On this tab, we are able to attach supporting documents to this invoice. These may include photographs of the work items received or perhaps a scanned copy of the invoice. On this tab, we can enter notes. Once we are sure that all of our entries look good, we can click on the OK button, and this will save our accounts payable invoice. The accounts payable batch screen now comes back into view, with our new invoice included in the list box on the right-hand side. We can now optionally tag the batch containing our new invoice and use the 3 buttons at the bottom of the screen
to process our invoices.
The first button is used to change the dates of invoices in the tagged batches. This allows us to indicate a new date, or indicate that we'd like to add a number of days or months to the dates of the invoices in the tagged batch. The second button is the proof listing. As we click on this button, we have the ability to set limits and print a proof listing of all the invoices in the batch. When printing proof listings, we usually set no limits, but simply press the print button. A listing is then displayed on the screen, which can be printed out. Use this listing to check your invoice entries for accuracy. The third button is the Post Tagged Batches button. When we press this button, the system will ask us for the fiscal period to which the invoices will be posted. The default is the current fiscal period, but we may choose any open fiscal period.
We then click on the Post button,
and the system will post our batch of invoices, print out our posting reports, and give us one last chance to view our reports and make sure our invoices have been properly posted. If they have been, we click the Finish button. If they have not, we can press the Undo button, and the system will return to the state it was in prior to the posting of our invoices. Once we have posted the invoices, they are now part of the permanent accounts payable invoice system
and can be accessed through the vendor entry window,
the overview screens, the payment selection screens, and the accounts payable aging reports. This concludes this session on entering and processing accounts payable trade invoices.